Good afternoon. I'm Susan Claver, Administrator of the State Historical Society of Iowa, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, along with all of the viewers from across the country joining us via C-SPAN, to the State Historical Museum of Iowa today. Every 4 years, Iowa becomes the focal point for presidential candidates, political insiders, and the entire country as we winnow the field during the first in the nation caucuses. And I couldn't be more excited for today's panel of experts who will dive further into this. Our program will include 1 hour discussing the history of the Iowa caucuses with a short 30-minute break where you can enjoy refreshments and also go visit the First in the Nation exhibit, which is on the first floor, and tours will be led by our state curator, Leo Landis. We'll then come back for an hour-long discussion about the horse race of the current field of candidates. And we'll also keep the exhibit open following the panel until 4:30. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator. This Iowa native is one of the best in the business, having spent 34 years as a political reporter for the Des Moines Register and now as host of Iowa PBS's Iowa Press. Please join me in welcoming David Yepsen.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. I want to thank the museum and staff for hosting this conversation today. For better or worse, the Iowa Precinct Caucuses have played a role in the selection of American presidents for over 50 years. From the modern origins in 1968 to the intense campaigning of today, these events have influenced the issues and candidates for our nation's highest office. Iowa's role has been influential and controversial. To discuss it all, we've assembled a panel of 7 political scientists and scholars who have spent much of their academic careers studying politics and these events in particular, several books written by these people on this Iowa caucus subject. And also they have all spent time helping hardworking reporters seeking to make sense of it all. Starting from your left, they are Dennis Goldford, Drake University, David Redlawsk, the University of Delaware, and formerly the University of Iowa, Donna Hoffman, the University of Northern Iowa, Dianne Bystrom, retired director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State University, Stefan Schmidt of Iowa State University, Kelly Winfrey, the Iowa State University School of Journalism and the Catt Center, and Peveril Squire, the University of Missouri and formerly of the University of Iowa. I might add, in the interest of hype, this is probably the largest panel of Iowa political scientists ever assembled on one stage to talk about the caucuses. And I think it's only fitting in this era where we're all involved in watching a large field of Democrats. It's good that this is happening in a state that is used to large cattle shows and debate stages. And in keeping with that theme, I've told each scholar we'll have 8 seconds to respond and 2 seconds to respond to attacks. As Susan mentioned, we'll have 2 panel discussions today. I want to thank the museum for this work in trying to develop a greater understanding of what are very significant events in our state's political history. Finally, I'd like to thank C-SPAN for being here today, making this accessible to all over the world. I'm a C-SPAN junkie myself, and I know many of you are. We appreciate them taking the time to really make this a nationwide event where people from all over the country can participate and watch this discussion. Yeah, that's right. Give me my hand. The first question, and I'll start with you, Dennis Goldford, and I'd like to just get a comment from each person up on this field, up on this stage. Dennis, what is the significance of the caucuses in the nation's political history and in Iowa's political history? Have they been a good thing or a bad thing for American democracy?
Well, you know, increasingly I've thought caucuses are great for me. They're great for us. Give us things to do. We get to meet people from across the country. We get to meet candidates, often help moderate candidate appearances. Whether or not there's something really good for the process itself of nominating a president, I'm becoming less and less confident of that. I think we have to remember that Iowa is not First, because we're important. Iowa is important because we're first. And in any serial nomination process, whoever goes first is going to have extraordinary importance in the whole process. So I think that we know, of course, that this is simply historical accident, the way all this arose. It's not the case that the Democratic National Committee, the Republican National Committee had a whole set of criteria by which they decided which state could go first, and oh, by and large, on a rational basis, it turns out that Iowa fulfills those criteria first. It's simply serendipity. It's simply historical accident. And until the rest of the country and all the other states don't like Iowa's position, but until everybody else can decide on what should replace this process, Iowa essentially stays where we are by inertia.
David Redlawsk.
Yeah, in that sense, it's kind of a game theory problem because everybody else wants to go first too, and so nobody's willing to let somebody else go first. My take is maybe a little bit different. I think the caucuses remain a valuable part of the nomination process, primarily because I think Iowans take them incredibly seriously. The research I've done on this shows that Iowa voters spend a lot of time thinking about what's going on, paying attention to the candidates and the events. And most importantly, from my perspective, because of this serial approach, Iowa voters provide information to later states about their sincere preferences, that is, who they really think should be the nominee, not some kind of strategic effort. Unlike most states, our research shows that Iowans are much more likely to vote sincerely, that is, pick the candidate they like, whether or not they think that candidate has a chance. And voters later on can use that information within the party to think about, okay, where should we go with this? I think that's a really valuable part of the process. If someone else went first, presumably eventually they would develop kind of the same capability, but Iowa's been doing it for so long, I think Iowans really have a good sense of what's going on.
And Professor Kelly Winfrey.
Donna Hoffman.
Donna, I'm sorry.
I would say that I'll take a little bit different spin on this. One of the things that a colleague and I have looked at in terms of our research is the role that the caucuses can play in helping strengthen the parties within the state. And Iowa, comparatively speaking, has pretty strong, healthy political parties, and that's actually good for democracy, even though a lot of people tend to want to eschew parties. Parties actually are a thing that are important. So I'll give you an example. About a year ago, we had a state senator in Northeast Iowa, where I am, who decided to retire, and so we had a special election. This was in March of last year, March of 2019. And so this race garnered lots of attention. The Democrat in the race, who ended up winning the seat, it was held by a Democrat, estimated he had 10 presidential candidates do various things for him, including recording videos, encouraging people to vote. It was a special election. You have to get turnout up. Walking door to door in neighborhoods. These aren't campaign functionaries. These are candidates themselves. About 10 of the candidates did that for this particular person, and that helps the political parties in the state. That also keeps the political parties competitive in the state as well, which helps Iowa in the general election also.
Dianne Bystrom.
Well, I think I'm going to, do we have to push these to talk?
No,
we don't. Okay, thank you. I'm going to agree with Dennis on this one, I think. I lived in Iowa for about 26 years, from 1996 to 2018. Now live in Nebraska, south of Omaha. And what I think over the years is that, when I was here, I felt the same thing that others have said, that Iowans are really serious about their choices. But I see this year as something different, particularly on the Democratic side, and I worry about the participation in the caucuses and how hard it is for some citizens to actually participate. They could be disabled, they could have childcare, they could have to work, and so that worries me. And what really then worries me is I look at the field of Democrats right now, and I see in Iowa that the top 3 contenders are all white guys, and it worries me about our winnowing the field that other states are going to have to then deal with, and not having a more diverse field.
You don't put Elizabeth Warren in that top tier?
Yes, I put her in the top 4, but I'm saying the top 3 polling right now are, from what I've seen in the recent polls. I mean, their polls are kind of all over the place, but Warren is, I think, 4th in the poll of polls.
We'll get to that in panel number 2.
Yeah.
Thank you. Stefan Schmidt?
Thank you. I've been in Iowa and at Iowa State for 50 years. I came here in 1970 to start being an academic at the university. So I've seen pretty much all the caucuses that make a difference. There were caucuses before the famous Jimmy Carter quote victory, but they were really party events where you elect officers and you do campaign plans and raise money and things like that. And so it's interesting for me to see pretty much the same questions raised every 4 years about the caucuses, every 4 years. And one of the things that always comes up as you get closer to the date of the caucuses is, isn't there somebody better than the people who are running right now? Somebody who can really win and is really presidential? And the answer is no. There is nobody better, simply because the process is people present themselves. There is an elimination of the ones that can't seem to get any traction, raise money, do well in the polls, and then someone emerges as the Republican and Democratic candidate. That's the way it works. And maybe there are better ways to do it. I think we'll talk about that later, maybe towards the end or during the cocktail party. But, oh, there's no cocktail party, I'm sorry. That's another event coming later in the month. But I think it's a wonderful, interesting process. It gives the news media something to do in times when there is no news, because they can send all their reporters to Iowa and they can report about, hay bales and, cattle and pancakes being flipped and deep-fried things at the fair. So I think the caucuses have a great historical place in American politics. And, at some point, maybe we move on to something else. But I think it's an effective way to get out messages.
Now, Kelly Winfrey.
Yes. I moved here 6 years ago, so this is my second cycle in Iowa. And wow, I heard about it before I got here. I studied political campaigns, but it's something that's certainly very unique. I think, first off, it's good for me, too. It's good for me both professionally and my personal interests. And I do think that there are some advantages to a system like this because it does allow candidates with low name recognition to sometimes stand out when they wouldn't be able to do that in a different system like a national primary. If we went with the people who were polling at the top before the caucus process started, Biden would be our candidate. Giuliani was probably a candidate in 2008. So things shift, and Iowa has an important part of that. But I also worry about how representative is in terms of both how white our state is and then the candidates that we end up selecting. So I think there's maybe some ways that we can address that and keep an Iowa caucus, or maybe something else comes along that better suits our current needs, given both the need for diversity and the number of candidates that we have competing these days.
And Pev Squire.
Let me just sort of sum up what a lot of my colleagues have said. One thing I want to remind Iowans is how special this process is. Having driven up this morning from Columbia, Missouri, I can assure you that much of the rest of the country is blissfully unaware that there's a presidential election coming. And in fact, I was reminded that I was back in Iowa when I passed the Amy for America bus on 163. And so this is a very unusual process. It's unusual that Iowa gets to be at the beginning of the process. And that comes to the second point I want to raise, which is this is not the way it was always, has always been. Our nomination systems have evolved dramatically over American history. This process, as it currently is configured, probably won't last well into the future. So one, enjoy it while it's here. And two, make sure that you take full advantage of it, because it is a rare opportunity. I mean, literally in Columbia, Missouri, we have no presidential candidates running ads. We are protected from that. Our phone calls have nothing to do with trying to recruit us to work for candidates or would like to find out who we're supporting. And of course, your world will return to normal a month from now. But as it stands right now, you get to be in the spotlight, and so enjoy it.
Yeah, Pev, some of us are actually looking forward to the resumption of farm chemical advertisements on television. Dennis Goldford, let's go back to the beginning. Tell us about 1968, what was happening in America, how this led to the start of the caucuses, the early caucuses.
1968, as many people remember or know from your history books, was a tough year. Of course, we had the troops sent to Vietnam. Barry Goldwater used to say during the '64 convention, everybody's afraid that if they vote for me, we'll have troops in Vietnam. And he said after Johnson was reelected, sure enough, people that voted for me have troops in Vietnam afterwards. And so we had, by '68, about 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and that sparked a big anti-war movement. We had the civil rights movement. We had the assassination of Dr. King, beginning of April, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, beginning of June, the night of the California primary. So it was a tough time. And of course, we had the disastrous Democratic Convention in August of 1968, later called a police riot. Just to be quick about all this, I'll just note that prior to, or at least through 1968, certainly prior to 1972, only about 25% of National Convention delegates to nominate a president were chosen through primaries. Most of the time, state and party officials, governors, senators, congressmen, party chairs, and so forth, they went to the National Convention with these votes in their pockets, so to speak, for the delegates from their state and spent them as wisely as they thought they could. When John Kennedy ran in the 1960 West Virginia primary, he didn't do it to get votes or delegates. He did it to show that a Catholic candidate could get votes in a very Protestant state. So through '68, only about 25% of the delegates were chosen through primaries. But with the '68 convention, the reaction was that perhaps the three most activated groups new to the process, single women, young people, and racial minorities, had been locked out. And with the disaster that occurred in Chicago, there was impetus to try to change the process, to open the nomination process up more to groups that hitherto hadn't been old white males back in smoke-filled rooms.
And that resulted in something called the McGovern-Fraser Commission, where the party decided that it would have earlier events to allow more people to participate. And Pev Squire, talk about 1972, George McGovern, Gary Hart, in the first round of these caucuses.
You know, when we begin to trace the history of the caucuses, 1972 sort of stands out. It's seen in retrospect as having been sort of the milestone where the Iowa Caucuses attained the status that they enjoy today. And that's a little bit misguided. Not many people paid attention to the Iowa Caucuses in 1972. They were first on the calendar purely by accident. Had to do with the rules under which the Iowa Democratic Party operated, and when they counted back the various states, they had to meet for the stages in the caucuses. They arrived at the beginning of the calendar, and nobody paid attention, and nobody made much of a fuss about it. And the candidates didn't make much of a fuss about it. We look at it now in retrospect and see that McGovern did better than people might have anticipated, and that was the first inkling that perhaps he was going to go on to the nomination. But in fact, he only spent a day and a half in the state before the caucuses. The media didn't really spend much time discussing them after they occurred. And it's not really until 1976 that you see sort of the modern caucus with all the attention that we begin to see, starting with Jimmy Carter and his efforts.
There was something significant, though, that happened in '72, and that was there were a few political reporters, national political reporters, who were here to cover it, one of them being Johnny Apple of the New York Times, who wrote in his piece about that election or the caucus that night that McGovern had an unexpectedly strong second place showing, which is sort of, we start with this expectations game right up front. Muskie won, but McGovern did well, better than expected. And let's go to 1976. Jimmy Carter picks up that playbook that George McGovern and Gary Hart, his young campaign manager, wrote, and what happened?
He does, and that expectation games becomes really built into the process with 1976. Jimmy Carter you may realize was a virtually unknown governor of a southern state that nobody paid any attention to. And when he said he was going to run for president, nobody was particularly excited about that. There were plenty of other Democrats who were plausible candidates. But what the Jimmy Carter campaign did was actually campaign. That is, from the time that Carter announced that he was going to run for president, he began running a grassroots campaign. He was out there. He himself in Iowa was knocking on doors. They were building campaign committees around the state. They were doing the kinds of things that we now take for granted in an Iowa caucus campaign, but that nobody had ever done before. And so Carter, the Carter campaign creates this sense that something's going on in Iowa, and manages, I think partly on the follow-up to Apple's story about 1972, to convince the national media that what happens in Iowa is going to matter, and uses Iowa as a springboard, as a way to say, this guy from Georgia you've never heard of is in fact a viable candidate, because a bunch of people in Iowa who had never heard of him either voted for him. And so Carter, the story goes, essentially won the caucuses and used that as the jumping off point to win the nomination and win the presidency. And in winning the presidency, sets up the underlying myth that you have to win Iowa to win the presidency. That turns out to be very much untrue for Democrats for pretty much the rest of the caucuses until we get to Barack Obama. But nonetheless, the myth is there, it's built on, and things start happening with respect to Iowa. On the Republican side, you know, there was nothing really going on from a caucus perspective yet. That doesn't come until a little bit later. But it's worth noting that you know, Jerry Ford was under pressure from Ronald Reagan, and I remember as you know, a teenager watching that convention and the uncertainty about whether or not Ford had the delegates to win the nomination to run in '76. Part of why Carter managed to win the presidency was Ford's weakened state. But this idea that Iowa meant something starts really with that. And the final coda is, of course, Jimmy Carter didn't win the caucuses. Like George McGovern, he lost to uncommitted.
David, one of the significant things about the '76 campaign on the Republican side was that Reagan, they did do a straw poll at their caucuses. It was the first time that the two parties had caucused together. And Ford won, but Reagan was very strong. And national reporters and people after the election said that Reagan illustrated Ford's weaknesses as a candidate and in the Republican Party. Again, underscoring that these people in Iowa are telling us things that happen later. McGovern in the power of the anti-war movement, Carter goes the distance, Ford is vulnerable. In 1980 was really one of the Super Bowl campaigns of the caucuses. Stefan, talk about Carter and Kennedy.
Well, there's a parallel between what's going on today and what happened in 1980, because there were two candidates who were strong, visible, good name recognition. Ted Kennedy, of course, the blue-blooded Massachusetts senator, and Jimmy Carter, who, as we were just told, was Jimmy who came out of all of this and was president. And it became a battle between, should we elect someone who is safe and who is president and is named Jimmy Carter, or should we move the party to the left and have Ted Kennedy become the standard bearer? And it was a difficult fight inside the party, and what it did was essentially it cleaved the party into two factions. We see some of that happening, I think, today. I mean, a lot of the discussion today is about moving left or staying safe, sort of in the Barack Obama, Joe Biden middle. And it peaked at the Democratic Convention in Madison Square Garden, where the fight became visible, the fight was covered. Ted Kennedy was struggling to get enough delegates and Jimmy Carter to hang on to the nomination. It's not very often that you have an incumbent president successfully challenged. We know that eventually Jimmy Carter prevailed and was on a course to re-election until, whoa, another historical moment that has parallels today. Let's see, what time is it? Because the Iranian hostage crisis broke out. The Iranian radicals who had overthrown the Shah took over the American embassy, took the American diplomats hostage. They were on television, blindfolded, marched out of the embassy. Some of you, my students here, you don't remember that. It was dramatic. It was as dramatic as if you watch CNN today, what's going on in Iran and Iraq now. And Jimmy Carter was unable to successfully respond to that crisis and therefore lost re-election. So it was a moment, you guys should study this a little bit, that whole history. Kennedy moved to the left, maybe that would have worked better. But sometimes there are parallels. Often there are no parallels, but sometimes there are.
One other thing that happened in 1980 was the rise of George Herbert Walker Bush, who beat Ronald Reagan in the caucuses. And again, the surprising finisher who goes on, and in Bush's case, winds up becoming vice president. But he coined the phrase coming out of here, I've got momentum, Big Mo. And that is one of the things that candidates even today look for. I think one of the other significant things, Carter as president really worked Iowa hard. Stroked Iowans, invited them to the White House. Mrs. Carter had note cards with Iowans on it. So that when Kennedy started to challenge Carter in Iowa, Kennedy had lost in a vote in Florida in a convention. And he's on to Iowa. And Carter had laid a trap for him here and beat him 2-1. In the 80 Democratic caucuses.
I was cooking out, grilling at a friend's farm in Story County one very hot summer afternoon before Carter's first nomination, and a bunch of people on bicycles came down this wide farm lane, and they came and got off their bikes, and he came over to us and he said, "Hi, my name's Jimmy Carter." And it was, who the hell is Jimmy Carter? So that's how he played Iowa. He bicycled through Story County and other places and went even to a small farm, well, it was a big farm, but a farm where there were a few people grilling out to introduce himself. Very good interpersonal relations.
Pev, we moved to 1984, the rise of Gary Hart.
1984 is expectations on steroids. It was a relatively small Democratic field, at least compared to this cycle. You had Walter Mondale, who was the overwhelming favorite, both nationally and here in the state of Iowa. And then you had a host of other candidates, most of whom were better known and were regarded as more serious candidates than Gary Hart. But what happened was the media set up expectations that Mondale should win going away. And when he got 49% of the vote, that didn't seem convincing enough to a lot of the media. And surprisingly, in second, Gary Hart finished with 17% of the vote, which put him into a position to then use that as a springboard to knock off Mondale in a big surprise in New Hampshire 8 days later. And that sort of sets up the whole idea that we have certain expectations built into how we think the caucuses are going to go. And then when someone fails to meet those expectations, they fall by the wayside. And in the case of 1984, that was really John Glenn. You may not recall, John Glenn was thought to be a very serious contender. He had the Right Stuff movie was coming out, and that was going to catapult him because of his heroics. And he fell flat. He got about 4% of the vote here in Iowa, and that was pretty much the end of his campaign. And so one of the things we have to anticipate, just putting this into the current context again, is what is it that we expect and who is going to surprise us and who's going to disappoint us this time around?
Kelly, I want to ask you about media and momentum. How does that work? What's at work in spinning reporters and momentum questions.
I mean, I think a big part of it has to do with polling. If you can start to gain some traction, especially when you're a candidate that's not well known nationally, that gets attention. Pete Buttigieg is our current example. Most of the country probably still doesn't know who he is or how to say his name. But once he started bubbling to the top, half of the 20-some field, that starts to get media attention. So again, it's those expectations. We expect Biden to be in the top, so that's not big news. But those candidates that we don't expect are going to get more of that coverage because it's news, right? It's not news if we thought it was if it's what we thought was going to happen. It's only news if it's not what we thought was going to happen. So that underperforming or overperforming becomes the center of that media coverage.
Before we leave 84, there's one other significant thing that is worth mentioning here. That just before the 84 caucuses, Iowa and New Hampshire cut a deal that Iowa would have the first caucus and New Hampshire would have the first primary, and the caucuses could not become like a primary. Dave Nagel, the state Democratic chairman in Iowa at the time, and George Bruno, the state chairman in New Hampshire, cut that deal. And the two states, instead of fighting each other over who would go first and leapfrogging, would agree to fight together. This is important today in this debate that is going on inside the Democratic Party, the Dianne reference about opening up and having access. Because whatever the Democrats do, satellite caucuses, absentees, even this business of doing a raw body count, runs the risk of alienating New Hampshire. So while it's an old deal that got cut, it very much is having an impact on the current race today. 1988, religious conservatives and the GOP. Donna Hoffman, talk about the rise of religious conservatives.
Sure. So in 1988, I think this is a surprising election or caucus in some ways because we were talking in 1980 about George Herbert Walker Bush getting the big momentum, winning in 1980 over Reagan, who would eventually get the nomination. And of course, in 88, Reagan's term limited, and Bush, the sitting vice president, is going to run for a term. And he actually comes in third in the caucuses. Dole from neighboring Kansas is going to win the caucuses. But sandwiched in there between Dole and Bush is Pat Robertson. Another parallel, perhaps, as Stefan was talking about, because here's somebody who kind of came out of nowhere, was a televangelist, essentially, never held elected office before, and is able to, again, bring attention to himself because he beats expectations, gets some media attention, not just in the state, but after he comes in a surprising second to parlay that into making a campaign of it across the country and wounding Bush somewhat in the process. Now, of course, Bush will go on to win the nomination. Another thing that we see, though, in 88 is sometimes how Iowans like candidates from neighboring states, because Bob Dole from neighboring Kansas does win, and sometimes that gets a candidate a little bit of credibility in the state, I think. And we're seeing that maybe potentially with Amy Klobuchar.
The next few races we're going to quickly skip. In 1992, there was no Republican count. President Bush was running for re-election, and Senator Harkin was running for the Democratic nomination, so the Democrats all bypassed the state, so really nothing much happens there. In 1996, Buchanan came in second behind Dole, which Dole won, and then in 2000, the Bush and Gore both win their respective caucuses and then go on and win in November. So those three caucuses really, to me, don't seem to have had the historic impact that some of these other things that we're talking about. But let's move then to 2004, because I'm watching this clock too. David Redlawsk, will you talk about the Bush, Gore, Howard Dean game?
Howard Dean. I think for most of us who were there and remember 2004, the thing we really remember is the Dean scream, right? On caucus night, when it turns out that Howard Dean comes in third, despite having been perceived as the front runner for months going into the final caucuses, he tries to parlay that into saying, we're going to continue, we're going to go to all these states. His voice rises, it gets louder, and he kind of yells, at the end, can see it on YouTube, of course. It's funny because in retrospect, looking at it, it doesn't really seem to be that big a deal to me. But at the moment it was, and it became the focus of the stories. And it points out the opposite side of the expectations game, that is the failure to meet expectations, right? So that Howard Dean is expected to win. He comes in third. John Kerry wins. John Edwards comes in second. And Dean is a distant third, really. And at that point, his chances are shot. And it's mainly because everyone thought he would win. He doesn't win. The media talks about it in that way very negatively. And the research we've done in our book, Why Iowa, we look at this media effect. And it's very clear that candidates who beat expectations on the positive side get a lot of attention and a bump. Candidates who fail to meet expectations on the negative side, like Howard Dean, get very quick attention, but then the media turns away from them and moves on to other candidates. What's really interesting to me about this, one quick point, is that if you actually look at the polling in the run-up to the caucuses, Dean hit his top point, his leading point, several weeks ahead and began to shift downwards in the last few polls. And Carrie actually became the leader in the last couple of polls, but that wasn't early enough for the media to shift its expectations. So he gains from beating Howard Dean, goes on, of course, to win the nomination, but lose the presidency.
And this relevance to this year, I think, is particularly applicable to Elizabeth Warren, who is skyrocketed at the beginning and now has slipped because of the media scrutiny that comes along with that rise. This person may become president, so media people have to pay more attention.
I want to note, too, it's really applicable to Joe Biden, who can't afford to do badly in Iowa as the national frontrunner, and who a month or so ago started tamping down expectations for exactly that reason.
Dianne Bystrom, let's move to 2008, Obama, Clinton, and Edwards.
Well, of course, I think, this is a very significant caucus year. You have two leading candidates in the Democratic Party, the first woman who actually is competitive for a nomination of a major political party, and then Barack Obama, first African-American male, very competitive. Like David was talking about, it's all about expectations. And if you remember back at that time, Obama was behind Clinton by double digits in the summer. And it wasn't until the Des Moines Register came out with this poll around Thanksgiving time in 2007 showing that Obama had taken the lead. I know Ann Seltzer personally, and I know that a lot of people at the time kind of doubted her poll because she put a special emphasis on independent voters that might show up in the caucuses that year. But her figures turned out to be very on point. And since that time, it's now rated, her poll is rated as an A+ by 538. And so very good polling by the Des Moines Register with Ann's cooperation. One other thing I would say, and we didn't mention this earlier, and I think you probably all know this, is that the caucuses are very different in Iowa. The Republican caucuses is a straw poll, and they report out numbers. The Democratic is a very complicated process of getting 15% of viability. When I was director of the Catt Center, which is a nonpartisan center, I thought it was very important for me not to be registered in either political party. So I was no party, and I participated as an observer in both the Republican and Democratic caucuses in my time here. So what I want to bring up is the importance of caucus math, and that's one thing that the Obama campaign really understood. They had a great team here. One of our graduate students, remember Jackie Norris, was in charge of it. They understood caucus math, and of course Barack Obama was relying a lot more on social media to get people out. But one of the things that happened at the caucuses that year is that Barack Obama was leading going into them. He got about 36.7% of the caucus delegate vote that night, but he was also playing math to where if he had saturated how many delegates were together in a room in the corner, he could peel off people, or his team, and they put them in Edwards' camp, because the other thing they were trying to do is to make Hillary Clinton finish third. She finished third by less than 1/3 of 1%. 29.8 to 29.5. But it was widely reported in the media that she had finished third. And in my view, that really, damaged her campaign going forward.
Let's talk a little bit more about Hillary Clinton, first woman candidate, how women get treated. I know that you and Kelly Winfrey have done some scholarship over the years on that subject. How was Hillary Clinton treated? Is it changing? How was she treated? What did you observe?
Well, I actually did a study that year of her coverage in the Des Moines Register and the New Hampshire leading paper. And what I really found out is that she was, and this is typical in all research, especially for women presidential candidates, they're covered more on campaign strategy. They're not covered on the issues. I can't remember the percentage off the top of my head, but in the Des Moines Register, Obama was linked to issues twice as many times as Clinton was. And that's something that we saw in the research dating back to the really early 90s, late 80s, that women are treated differently by the media. It's really improved for women voting, running for statewide races like governor and Senate, and also with congressional races. But where we still see this difference in coverage is when a woman, Republican or Democrat, runs for vice president or president.
Kelly Winfrey, what are your thoughts about Clinton's treatment?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly still a problem. I think that one of the things that I'm seeing that's interesting this cycle is something different than what we've seen in the past, is women tend to not be covered on their policies as much, but because Elizabeth Warren is the woman with the plan, she's been scrutinized a lot for those policies in ways that are not similar to what you've seen of, for example, rising star Pete Buttigieg. And so I think there's still some inequality there. And then you also get the electability question in everything from local media to national media when it comes to women candidates. And I think it's even a little bit harder this time because Hillary Clinton lost to Trump. There's a concern that, well, that must mean that women aren't electable. So even though I like this woman, I don't think she's electable. And I have some survey research I've just completed, the surveys that kind of indicate that while Warren is liked by a lot of people, there's concern that she's might not be able to win a general election.
I want to get into the electability material in the second panel, and I want to move to 2012. Dennis, what happened with the reporting of the Republican results that year?
Well, this is where, when we always talk about horse race matters, I think you have to be very careful. 2 weeks before the caucuses in 2012, Mitt Romney was shown as the leader, certainly, and everybody expected him to win. Rick Santorum at that point was in the low single digits. And yet on caucus night, Santorum seemed to lose to Romney by, I believe it was 8 votes. And then a couple weeks later, a missing box came in from somewhere in Iowa, from one of the Republican precincts, that put Santorum up by 34 votes. So poor Matt Strawn, former chair of the Iowa Republican Party, had to deal with all that. Matt's a great guy, and he just really was in a tough situation there. But you have to remember that caucuses, as several have said, are internal party events run by the parties themselves, not by the state electoral machinery. So these sorts of things can happen at times. Now, Santorum complained bitterly that cost him momentum, but my argument was, and it echoes what several people have said, because he had so vastly exceeded expectations by finishing in a virtual tie, plus or minus, with Mitt Romney, he had already, in effect, quote unquote, won the caucuses.
But the Republicans screwed up the count.
Right.
And there have been other things counts that have been questioned, argued about throughout the history of the caucus. 2016, Donna Hoffman, we had an argument between the Bernie people and the Hillary people over that count.
Sure, and a couple of things to keep in mind here. There's always error in counting. It's when it's really close that it can matter. We saw that in 12 with the GOP. We saw it in 16 then with Clinton and Sanders. But the other thing to recognize here is that we also need to put the caucuses in the proper perspective. This is a caucus/convention method, and all you're doing on caucus night is selecting delegates to go to the next level of convention, which is the county, and people can actually change their minds in 30 days historically about 30 days between those periods. With Clinton and Sanders, you had a very interesting race here because Clinton obviously is going to come back from her 2008 loss. She will eventually get the nomination, but Sanders gives her a surprising run for her money, especially in the state. It essentially comes out as a tie, more or less. Clinton can claim to have won. Again, as Dianne was mentioning, Democrats and Republicans do things very differently. The Democrats report what is called the state delegate equivalent, which they will not do this cycle, or they will do additional things this cycle. The state delegate equivalent was, virtually a tie, 700.47 for Hillary Clinton, Clinton and 688.6 for Sanders. And then you can do that percentage, and they were separated by about 0.4%. And in some places there were ties, and in the rules in those places, they flipped coins. And that became then part of the narrative, was that Hillary Clinton had rigged it somehow because she won more coin tosses than Bernie Sanders did. But the important point to discuss here is that Sanders did extraordinarily well, beat those expectations again, also having not been a Democrat. And Hillary Clinton still could say, though, that she had won, and that was important for her going to the next state.
You know, in both 2012 and 2016, races were decided by microscopic margins. I think 2 weeks after they declared Romney the winner, the Republicans came around and said, well, it was really Rick Santorum, which crushed his campaign. If you don't win the headline the day after the caucuses, you're done. And some controversy about that. Then the 2016 dispute led the Bernie people to demand that the initial preferences of people as they come into the caucus be tabulated, which is a first, which causes heartburn in New Hampshire, stay tuned, and which will have a lot of confusion on caucus night in the reporting of the results. When do reporters, what do reporters get? What information do they get first? That will shape their story. Does the Iowa Democratic Party release the raw body count and then the delegate equivalents, or do the delegate equivalents and then later do the raw body count? So those two caucuses, I think, are significant because of the huge stakes that are involved in a caucus victory or loss, and the changing in the rules.
Wasn't it the Russians who messed with the ballot boxes and Vladimir Putin? No? Already back then? We don't know.
We don't know. We'll have to wait for it. Dennis, I want to talk about 2016 on the Republican side. The rise of conservative populism, Donald Trump doing well. What did you see there in watching that race?
When I attended and covered a lot of caucus events on both sides in 2016, but particularly on the Republican side, my sense, and again, it's not based upon survey polling data or anything like that, it's just experience covering caucuses and getting the sense of a crowd. There was a lot of anger and a lot of fear at Republican events, just concern about where the country was going. They certainly never saw Barack Obama as a legitimate president. And you had an argument, say, from somebody like Ted Cruz, and there's a mirror image of this in the Democratic side. I think it's going on today. You got some people in a party, say in 2016 on the Republican side, the Cruz argument was Republicans lose presidential elections when candidates are not conservative enough. And again, we've got that reverse argument on the Democratic side today. And the argument is that there's a natural conservative majority out there in the country, and if you just nominate the right person who's sufficiently and consistently and articulately conservative, they'll win the election, sweep to power, and solve all the country's problems. That was the approach of Cruz. You had somebody like Scott Walker who tried to be a more kind of pragmatic but still very conservative candidate. But at a lot of these events, Donald Trump would show up. But on the one hand, there was a certain entertainment value. Of course, here was a TV celebrity. On the other hand, audiences connected in certain ways. And my carefully cleansed phrase has been that Mr. Trump always represented what I call the middle finger segment of the American electorate. In other words, the people who are fed up with politics and politicians as usual. And there was a big audience for that kind of message, certainly on the Republican side, because they thought the standard Republican candidates were not taking care of business. And he obviously capitalized on that and continues to do so.
Does anyone on the panel recall the similarities of the Bernie voters and the Trump voters, and that after the nominations were, by the time we got to the general election, What percentage of people who supported Bernie Sanders actually wound up voting for Donald Trump? Does anyone?
It was a high percentage. And I can't remember. I saw something recently, so I believe it was 87% of Sanders supporters actually voted for Hillary Clinton, but that was a bigger margin than, for example, when you had Obama, and a large percentage of Clinton supporters voted for Obama. It was in the 90s. So there was a significant difference of about 10 percentage points, as I recall. It was something that was just published. So the Sanders people didn't do it. In a book that Kelly and I contributed in the 2016 election, there was actually a team from the University of Missouri that came here. Ben Warner and Mitchell McKinney led it, and they actually did some survey research of people that attended Sanders rally, a Trump rally, Cruz, and a Clinton rally. And what they found is that some of the Sanders and Trump supporters shared some of the same characteristics as far as what was motivating them to support that candidate, kind of tear down the system type thing.
Also, what they share is the fact that Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. He's coming from a different place, and so he is able to use the Democratic Party as his vehicle. And obviously, Donald Trump is not a Republican. I mean, he is a Republican because he ran as a Republican, got elected. But his policy positions, his criticism of W. Bush and the war in Iraq and stuff, you know, he is basically attracting those people who really don't like the actual candidates of the party and want something different. But the people have to run on a party, because you can't win elections in the United States as an independent or as a democratic socialist, you know. So you have to hijack a party and then use the party machinery and identity and hope that you're attracting enough people, which Donald Trump did, and Bernie Sanders never got there. But I think Sanders is still doing the same thing now. I know a lot of people who really don't think that Bernie Sanders should be running as a Democrat, that he should be running as a democratic socialist. So anyway, we can talk about that, I guess, in the next phase here.
Looking at the other side of this, that is what the candidates themselves were saying, what I found was that Sanders and Trump's rhetoric was quite similar, right? It was about, in effect, blowing up the system. It was about the big guys are screwing you over. They had different definitions of who the big guys were, but it was still very similar rhetoric. I've done an initial analysis of about 6 or 8 speeches from each of the candidates that I recorded here in Iowa, and they track together incredibly closely compared to every other candidate.
We've got a few minutes left before we take our break. I raced through these races quickly, as you noticed. Any other thoughts left behind here or observations that you have? Pav, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, having looked at this process early on, what things do you see in the evolution of the caucuses today? How have they changed?
I think that we still sort of enjoy this myth that was created by Jimmy Carter of the candidate spending nights around the state, building up an organization literally from grassroots, that I think has come and gone. That we now see the role of money playing a much bigger part in the process than was the case, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And of course, technologically, things have changed. So we have social media as a way to organize and mobilize supporters in a way that we didn't before. And so I think the caucuses themselves have changed dramatically over 40 years, that the process that was in place in 76 and 84 is fundamentally different than the process that's been in place for the last 8 years or so.
And where are we headed with it? Dennis, go ahead.
I was just going to note, anecdotally, remember the Republicans used to have a straw poll in Ames in the August before a caucus year. And 2011 was the last straw poll, and I had a visitor from Great Britain who was interested in presidential politics. And remember that, you know, for Carter, he came out here and he was completely under the radar. Well, Tim Pawlenty was appearing at a coffee shop in Adel, of course, small town somewhat west of the Des Moines metropolitan area. And we went out there, and sure enough, there was Governor Pawlenty from Minnesota sitting there talking with 3 or 4 voters. By my count, there were 33 media people surrounding them. So there's nothing under the radar anymore. But the broader point, I think, and again, maybe I'm a contrarian here, is that with the issue of the recount or the counting, for example, the caucuses simply were not built to bear the burden that the rest of the country puts on them for presidential politics.
Dianne, talk about social media. I want to. What is the impact now today of social media on campaigning here?
Well, it's increasing in each cycle, and it's going to be totally different in the 2020 cycle because of the penchant for our current president to tweet policy all the time and to actually people engage with him in tweets as well, which has forced the media, the mainstream media, to basically use Twitter to cover the president. We can get more about that later. But one of the things that Daniela Dimitrova, my colleague at Iowa State University, and I did is that we used a panel survey from Iowa State that they've done for several cycles on likely caucus goers. And what we were interested in is their media diet. So what we have is, particularly from 2016, is that what we found is with likely caucus goers, both Democrat and Republican, information on the internet was really in fourth place. They got most of their information from cable news, then local news, then network, local, cable, and newspaper, and then internet was fourth with about 35% or so. But of that, what we found is that especially Democrats and certainly young people, if they actively followed a presidential candidate on Twitter and they liked his posts or her posts, they were likely to caucus. And so we did find a social media effect. David did a little bit in his book, Why Iowa, started doing research on that with one of his colleagues at the University of Iowa. So I think this whole research, a new thing that I'm getting into is, and I know Kelly's doing it as well, is the impact of social media just on the political processes. And I think we're finding more of that interaction in each election cycle. And I think 2020 is going to be one.
Kelly Winfrey, do you want to
elaborate?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm finding with this cycle. The survey that I just took out of the field that showed that television news sources were still above social media and internet sources. So cable news, network news, and local news, but after that was social media. So it seems to be rising above some traditional sources like radio and newspaper. And the other thing I'll say about it is that social media allows candidates, the current president and also candidates, to communicate directly with voters about what their stance on issues are, allows them to respond to any controversies. And one thing I think that's been really important in Iowa is using it to organize, to get people to show up to events, to happy hours, to whatever, to get them involved in the campaign in ways that were much harder to do when you had to call or door knock.
Stephan, you had a thought?
The 1988 election with Pat Robertson going into the caucuses, I think, is really more important than has been given credit. Because I think what he did was he legitimized politics for evangelicals. In other words, evangelicals stayed away from politics because they said it's secular, it's dirty, it is not godly. And when he ran, evangelicals slowly became active in politics. And we see how active they are now in 2020. They have decided that politics is the way for them to basically bring godly and scripture to the American political system on issues like abortion and gay rights and other things. And so I think that it was quite important in 1988 that he presented himself as a presidential candidate.
I think religion has always played an important role in Iowa politics. You go back to the Civil War and the role of faith on both sides of that, and certainly saw it here. Prohibition, the civil rights movement. There is a religious left. I used to always talk about evangelicals, and I would hear from evangelicals on the left who say, we're in a different camp here. Well, and they're motivated by the anti-war movements in Vietnam. So this is just sort of continuing a tradition in which faith and religious values play a real role in the outcome of elections on both sides. David, you had a...
Dave, you started this off, David, by asking what was different, and Pev gave us a good sense of some of the things that are now different, particularly the money and what have you. But there is a lot that is still the same. This is still about organizing. It's still about organizing at the precinct level. It's still about door knocking. It's still about person-to-person contact. We've been in the field also, as many research teams have, asking likely Iowa caucus goers about what's going on. And at this point, we have 90% of our respondents say they've been contacted personally by at least one campaign. So it's still about that kind of person-to-person politics, even in a world of social media, even in a world of money. What the money's buying in Iowa now, besides Tom Steyer's television ads, is organizing. It's offices, it's staff, it's the ability to build a campaign from nothing and show us that you can build and sustain something going forward.
I think one thing that's important about that is that it's so unique to Iowa because Iowans expect to be called, to have someone knock on their door, to shake the hands of the candidate. No one else expects that in the rest of the country, really. And that's what makes it necessary here. It's not because it's a necessary way to campaign, but it's because of what Iowans demand of candidates.
Any other thoughts about the history of these events? We'll take a half-hour break, and we'll come back and talk about the good stuff, which is who's winning, who's losing, and what's your handicap on the race. So with that, we'll take a 30-minute break. Please take a moment to go see the caucus history exhibit, and we'll be back at the bottom of the hour to talk about the horse race. Thank you. Have everybody take their seats, please. And I'd also like to reconvene our panel discussion on the history and handicap in the 2020 Iowa caucuses. We had a great discussion in the first hour about the history of these events. We may come back to some of the themes we were talking about there. But in this hour, I want our scholars to focus on the current caucus race and how they see the race unfolding, who's ahead, who's behind. To aid in that discussion, I'm going to report we have breaking news. CBS poll just out has Sanders at 23, Biden at 23, Buttigieg at 23, Warren at 16, and Klobuchar at 7. So, details at 6. So,
that's Iowa?
no, CBS News.
No, but it's
State.
In Iowa, yes, that's
Okay.
in Iowa, the race in Iowa.
And Buttigieg also 23?
Yeah.
See, I was right.
Oh, it's their battleground tracker.
3 white guys at the top.
Okay.
And the other
Yes,
one not
you were.
qualified.
All right, I want to start, and Pev, I'll start with you. How do you see this race? You watch it from your perch there in Missouri. How do you see this contest?
Watching it from afar, I have no greater insight than if I were immersed in it right now. I had just noticed that CBS poll. It seems consistent with sort of the impression I have, which is that we really don't know what will happen on caucus night. That there are lots of different scenarios and several candidates who clearly seem to have enough support in the state that it's showing up. But one of the things I would want to caution people, and David and some of the other people here on the panel can talk about this, is that survey work is very difficult these days. It's difficult to get people to respond. It's difficult because of landlines versus cell phones. Difficult to try to predict who's going to show up on caucus night. And of course, if you have weather like today, turnout may be great. And if weather's terrible, which it never seems to be on caucus night, but there's always that potential, and particularly if it's in one part of the state rather than another part, that could have a big impact. So I think all we can tell you from the surveys that have been done so far is that it's really not at all clear what's going to happen caucus night, and for those of us who are political junkies, that probably adds to the fun. But as scholars, we would like to be able to say something with a little bit greater certainty than we have no better guess than you do.
Kelly Winfrey?
I have all the answers. No, I'm just kidding.
Please share.
I'm keeping those, and I'll tell you on February 4th. No, I completely agree. I mean, we're all guessing at this point, and polling, especially when you think about who will show up that night, is pretty important, and that has changed outcomes of both Iowa caucus results and general elections of who shows up. I think it's interesting that Dianne was exactly right, so that the 3 top polling people are white men, and then we have 2 qualified women running. So I'm curious to see how it shakes out. I think one of the most interesting things will be how those second choice picks come, because there is support for Booker, there is support for Yang, there's support for Klobuchar. They probably won't be viable in a lot of precincts. So where they go can have a big impact. If they all go to Warren, then it's a four-way tie. If they all go to Biden, it's a runaway victory for Biden. So that second place is going to have a big impact on what those final results are.
Explain why the second place showing in a poll is important to what's going to happen on caucus night.
Well, the second place. When I say second place, I mean your second choice at the precinct.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Yeah. So for those of you on the Democratic side who haven't done this on the Democratic side before, and what will be different this year is that whenever you make your first pick, if you don't have 15% of the people there supporting that candidate, the candidate is considered not viable. So one of two things have to happen. Either A, you need to get more people to reach that threshold and become viable, or B, go to your second choice. It used to be there could be multiple alignments and people could do more movement. This time it's one realignment. So that's going to really limit things. So maybe I really feel good about Yang and I go to him, he's not viable. Now I have to vote not my heart but my head, and that might be Biden. And so I think that's going to cause a lot of shifting.
Stephen Schmidt, what do you say to reporters who are calling you up saying, how do you see this race?
Well, I think the highly contested Republican, Donald Trump, will win that. Unless something happens between now and caucus night in Iran that, really shocks people. You have to look at national polls as well as Iowa. I mean, Iowa is influential, but a very, very famous political analyst and journalist once said that there are 3 tickets out of Iowa. I think that was you. Yeah. The first class, second class, and the back of the cabin next to the toilet. But if you're seated next to the toilet and the year is not the right year for the first and second class Iowa caucus placers, you may end up getting the nomination. You may even end up winning the election. So in Iowa, you don't have to win. You can come in first, second, or third and still do very well politically. I wrote an article for the newspaper that you formerly and sadly don't work for anymore, the Des Moines Register, which I see has gone into tremendous decline since you left. I blame it all on you. Social media had nothing to do with it. You left and the thing just collapsed. But I argued that this may be one of those wonderful years when we have a brokered convention this summer where nobody has enough delegates, and you come in there and you've got Biden and Sanders and Buttigieg and maybe Warren as well coming in with a chunk of delegates and fighting it out on the floor. That would be the greatest thing in my life, is to see that happen, because it would be real democracy at work.
You don't see them literally fighting?
Maybe literally. Yeah.
My money's definitely on Buttigieg in that case.
2 things I always hear every 4 years. This will be the last time Iowa has caucuses, and maybe there's going to be a brokered convention.
Well, you heard it again. That was my job.
One time it's not right.
Dianne, Bystrom?
To kind of play on, again, I did predict earlier without hearing from CBS News that the 3 top vote getters in Iowa at this point in time were the 3 white guys. And again, getting back to what I said earlier, one of the things I worry about with the Iowa caucuses is that it diminishes the choices for other states. So, you see this, but I think Kelly made a good point, and I was glad to know when I talked a little bit about caucus math earlier and how candidates have been able to use it. That's not going to be as possible this year, because when you go in, you have to actually put your second choice and you have to stick with it. I do think, I've seen some recent data on Sanders supporters basically on their donation giving. So for example, earlier in this campaign, you might give to Biden, but you also gave to Warren, and you might have given to Buttigieg. What you see with Sanders supporters is that they typically don't have a second choice. And so I think what could happen, as Kelly just said, is with this second choice on these candidates are not going to be viable, who do they flock to? And I actually think that we'll see some flocking basically to Biden, Buttigieg, and Warren.
Donna Hoffman.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. One, this race is incredibly fluid. I think the other people who have talked about it, that's a good way, I think, to characterize it. It's fluid. There are a lot of people, there's a wealth of candidates for the Democrats. A lot of people have a first choice, but they also have a second choice. Their polling has showed they're relatively open to changing their mind. And the dynamics of caucus night could do that. Now, I'd like to push back on what Stefan said, though, about brokered conventions. I think that's a thing to talk about, but I think it's probably rarely going to happen because it's not in a party's interest to get to that point. So even in 2008, when you had Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama going down even to June, that was really late, they didn't go into the convention because it's really, especially if you're going to be running against an incumbent president, it's not in the party's interest to do that. So the party will probably do the things that they need to do to try to eliminate that. Now, they've also, in talking about the rule changes in the earlier part of the session here, one of the other things the Democrats have done have changed how superdelegates are going to factor into that. That could be an issue later on as well. Mm-hmm. But the third thing I'd like to mention here is to not forget that the GOP has caucuses also. You could learn really interesting things by looking at the GOP caucus. The diehard GOP people are the ones who in years where they have incumbents tend to go, but there also may be people who want to show dissatisfaction. It is notable that the Iowa GOP has not canceled their caucuses. The GOP in many other states have canceled their primaries and caucuses precisely because they don't want to publicize any kind of opposition within the party. These are party events. The GOP, in order to help them maintain first-in-the-nation status, didn't want to do that. They didn't want to see this process as being rigged for the incumbent president. So there will be GOP caucuses. And also note, for both the Democrats and the GOP, at a caucus, it's more than just saying, here's the candidate I like. It's also about elevating platform planks. It is also about governance within the party, electing people to central committees and those kinds of things. And these are important factors that we also, the national media never really reports on at all. But these are important in the party building aspects of what caucuses are and in the very little d democratic nature of them as well.
David Redlawsk, I might want to just share with our audience that you've been spending time since August really doing field research, going from event to event, watching these candidates at work. So what's your sense of who's ahead and who's behind?
Yeah, I've been here since ahead of the state fair and have been tweeting as I go, live tweeting it, mainly to keep notes for myself. It's an effective way to do that at the events. So I've probably been to 85 or 90 candidate events at this point. And I'm no more certain about the outcome than anybody else as we're looking at this. The poll that was just reported makes sense to me. It kind of tracks with what I think we're seeing. We've been doing some survey research work as well and just did a second wave on that. And it's very, very similar. But what's really, really important here, people have been mentioning the second choice piece. There are key changes to the Democratic rules that are going to change the nature of the caucus and what actually can happen on caucus night. Earlier in the first half, there was a comment about how Barack Obama in 2008 sent voters to John Edwards groups when they had more than they needed to be viable in a precinct. That is to have at least 15% to get a delegate. That can no longer be done. When people come into their Democratic caucus and they express their first preference, they will be locked into that first preference if their candidate is viable. There'll be no more moving around for those people. The only people who will be allowed to move are those whose candidates don't get at least 15% in the precinct. That really does change the dynamic of what happens on caucus night, which has a lot to do, again, with how the delegate counts are reported. But the Democrats are going to tell us the actual vote count for the first time, both the initial vote count and what they call the realigned vote count after every candidate who doesn't reach 15% is dropped. So the media is going to have three different numbers to work with. I'm not quite sure where they're going to go with it. I was looking at the CBS poll where they're emphasizing the number of delegates each candidate would win if the numbers in the poll hold. But I suspect on caucus night, the fallback's going to be what's the vote look like. But the question is going to be, is it the initial vote or is it the final vote? That means a lot for a candidate like Amy Klobuchar, who is unlikely at the moment, although everything can change in the next few weeks, to be viable in many precincts, meaning she'll get 0 in those precincts on the realigned vote, but she'll have had votes in the initial alignment. I'm saying all of this, A, to say it's going to be a lot more complicated than it was to even know who the winner is, and B, to simply talk because even after 85+ events, it's just not clear to me where Iowans are going. I'll make one other point about that. In our most recent data, 62% of Sanders voters say they're unlikely to change their mind, 56% of Biden, but 39% of Buttigieg, 33% of Warren, and only 30% of Klobuchar voters say they're certain about who they're voting for. There's a lot of movement still possible here.
David, as the reporter on this stage, I can tell you what number is going to be reported, and that's the one we have first.
Well, I think the IDP's intention is to release it all at the same time.
Well,
whether they'll be able to or not, I don't know.
Because, yes,
that's their
and this gets
intention.
into our discussion earlier about not turning this into a primary and New Hampshire's concerns. Will the Iowa Democratic Party have this information but sit on it until they have the delegate equivalent number and release it all at the same time? The problem with that is caucuses are open events. Reporters can go to caucuses and watch the count themselves and have anecdotally some idea of what that initial body count is. But reporters are going to be standing on deadlines. Editors and producers and news directors will be screaming at them, you know, what's going on, and you go with the first information you've got, and that shapes the narrative the whole rest of the evening. That has happened in every caucus that I have covered.
Well, the Republican story in 2012 is a great example of that, because they went with Romney because that's what the party told them, but that wasn't actually what had happened. And in 2016, I sat in the media center watching the frustration as midnight came and the Democrats had not actually reported their results yet. The party does intend to report all of the numbers at the same time, but we'll see if that actually happens.
And this whole issue of this count is one of the biggest criticisms that is made and has been made of these caucuses from the very beginning. Counts are spotty, they're sporadic, they're not like a primary, which is run by government, they're run by parties. And it is one of the big criticisms that we have. Dennis, I didn't mean to leave you out of the conversation.
It's quite fine. Sometime this past fall, a reporter asked me, "What surprises do you expect?" And I said, "Listen to what you just asked me. If it's a surprise, you can't expect it. If we expect it, it's not a surprise." I love what journalists do. I wish we still had newspapers, but I'm not interested in the journalistic, prediction of who's going to come in where. I've got a broader interest. I don't want to hijack your question, but I think I'm more interested in the water than the fish that are swimming in it. And I think that what we see right now with the Democrats is a continuation of the problem for Democrats is they still have not figured out who they are in a post-Reagan era. In the 1990s, I went back and I looked at national party platforms. I looked at the 92 Democratic platform, Clinton, Republican platform, George H.W. I didn't look at Ross Perot. I always thought of him as sort of an historical speed bump. But I went back then and I looked at the 1968 platforms, Humphrey, Nixon, and remember George Wallace, of whom President Trump is seen by some as the latest iteration after Pat Buchanan in between. And if you exclude foreign affairs, because in 68, obviously, as we talked about at the beginning, it was all about Vietnam. If you look at social and domestic policy, from 68, and then look at 92, when foreign affairs at that point weren't a big issue. I didn't have 9/11 yet. The Soviet Union was gone. The 92 Democratic platform looked very much like the 68 Republican platform in terms of social and domestic policy. And the 92 Republican platform looked very much like the 68 Wallace platform. And Democrats are still trying to figure out who they are and how to talk about politics beyond just laundry lists of policies. And I think that we see that right now in this argument. I said there's a mirror image going on the Democratic side that we saw with, say, Cruz and the Republicans in 16. You've got the Warrens and the Sanders arguing basically for a kind of base election, right? That we need to win the election by getting out, turning out progressives and the, I hate the terms left and right, but the more progressive kind of liberal. Whereas you've got the Bidens and the Buttigiegs and the Klobuchars saying, no, there's still a kind of centrist liberalism that's going to win the election. And I think that's the big argument right now we see between those two sets of candidates, and we see that playing out to some extent here in Iowa. Again, how that will play out election night, I don't have any more of a clue than anybody else.
Dianne?
I just want to say one brief thing. One of the other things I think that could impact this race is what's going on in the Middle East. It impacted the 2004 race, I believe, with John Kerry. And so if there's an international crisis and that's still looming above us, and if it ratchets up, I think that could help Joe Biden, because I think he's typically perceived as the person with the most international experience.
I see heads nodding. Stefan, you agree with that the Middle East...
Venezuela now has finally admitted that Maduro is a dictator, because they just shut down the legislature, no more opposition elections, and Mr. Guaido, who is the president of Venezuela, of the Democratic constituency of Venezuela, is now finished. I work with a lot of my former Venezuelan students on the Venezuela Democracy Project. This is the end, of that, especially since the Trump administration is going to concentrate on the Middle East now. Venezuela is too much trouble. So those are all foreign policy challenges.
Is there an agreement here that the foreign policy crisis, Kelly, what do you think, works to Biden's benefit?
I think it works to Biden's benefit and perhaps Buttigieg's benefit as well. I mean, in theory, it should work towards the benefit of some of the other senators that are running. But
why Buttigieg?
Because of his military experience, and because a fair amount of his stump speech is related to being a leader in the world and kind of that moral American authority. But I think that Americans have a short attention span, especially for things that aren't in the United States. And so I think some of the economic arguments that are appealing from the Sanders and Warren side of the party are going to continue to be important. It really depends if the situation with Iran escalates to a point of we're in a war, then that becomes, an advantage for Biden. But short of we are now in a war, I don't think that it's going to matter all that much to most voters.
Pev Squire, what do you think?
I think that what the Democrats may be forced into thinking by all the activity that we see around the world is that their desire to get rid of Trump and to remove him from office will lead them to support whichever candidate appears through the information that's available as the most likely to be able to do that. So and at this point, it's Biden.
So electability.
Electability, and beyond just electability, there's sort of an existential sort of notion that Trump has to be removed, and I think many Democrats will determine that Biden, even if he's not their preferred candidate, may be the only option.
Dennis, Middle East,
but just
quick.
in regard to that, of course, typically there's a rally around the flag effect with presidents if we get into some sort of war. Whether that would occur in this particular case, I don't know. But in terms of this idea of removing President Trump from office, there has been an assumption in Republican politics for, I think, quite a number of years now that no Democrat can win an honest and legitimate election. And the corollary to that is if the Democrat appears to have won, then it must not have been an honest and legitimate election. And so if any of these people happen to, at least what we see, beat President Trump, there's going to be tremendous blowback, arguing, remember his concern even in 16, I think this process is rigged anyway. So Democrats have got to face that as well.
The fact is, no matter who wins the election, there's going to be blowback from the losing side.
So the Democrats should pick someone who's going to lose the election so there's no blowback.
No, I'm not saying that.
I think it's just a fact of life. Donna Hoffman, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the Republicans, and they're having caucuses too. Why? Party building?
Well,
Yes. Now, every party, when they have an incumbent president, and even in the mid-year elections, the parties have caucuses. These are 2-year events, not 4-year events, we should remember. Typically, when you have an election like this, we can compare it to the Democrats in 12, the party diehards will come, but you know that Obama's going to get the nomination. So, I mean, we can pretty much assume Trump's going to get the nomination. But the party, the Democrats, for instance, in 12, didn't squash opposition, if there was any, at a caucus to Obama. The Republicans are running up to that line in some way. So we have both Walsh and Weld. Both of them have experience. They're legitimate candidates in this sense who are challenging Trump. That will be present in those rooms. What kind of percentage will they get, if any, in some of these precincts? They will get some in some places, and I think it will be interesting to see where that support that is not Trump comes from and how strong it is. And I think those are data points that are going to get lost because the attention is going to be on the Democratic side. But I think there's a lot of interesting things that could happen on the Republican side related to that, potentially some platform issues, but those are secondary.
I'm glad you mentioned that because the caucuses have an effect beyond just the presidential race. All politics is local. First of all, they are an important organizing tool. You mentioned 1984. Senator Harkin once told me that one of the reasons he won in 1984 was that the Democrats had a caucus, a spirited presidential caucus that year, and he had wonderful lists of names of activists in every precinct and corner of the state, and the Republicans didn't have a similar caucus battle. Reagan was getting reelected, and so Senator Harkin said that was really a pivotal thing to me. And the proof of that is that on caucus night in 1984, during that day, President Reagan came to Iowa, and he flew into eastern Iowa, I think it was Waterloo, but I could be wrong, did an event, and then flew into the Des Moines media market. And Air Force One left Iowa 30 minutes before the Republican caucuses started, which was really brilliant. It sucked all the oxygen of the day away from the Democrats and gave it to the Republicans. And I would just not be surprised to see Air Force One in Iowa on February 3rd. If it happens, it's a page out of Reagan's book.
And David, I think that's a really important point. This time around, it's the Democrats who are organizing. It's the Democrats who have the lists. It's the Democrats who are knocking on everybody's door in the state, apparently. And there are a lot of them, and so there are a lot of staff, there are a lot of volunteers, and the Republicans, even though they'll hold a caucus, none of that is happening on the Republican side. This may have real repercussions for the Senate race in Iowa in 2020, for the congressional races, all of which are likely to be competitive races, because the Democrats will be better organized, at least at the front end. And
there is a real battle for control of the Iowa House of Representatives.
Right, the legislature as well.
All politics is local, and I think I appreciate the audience member who called that the organizing issue to our attention. So what happens now? Who gets what tickets? We talk about who gets tickets out of Iowa. I wonder, in this age of money in politics, if this is, and the age of social media, if that old rule ever still works, because it's not 3 tickets out of Iowa. I mean, everybody's got their own airplane to leave Iowa. And, if say Sanders, Biden, and Buttigieg finish in the top 3, Elizabeth Warren gets the 4th ticket out of Iowa. The fact is, these candidates have so much money now that the original premise in Iowa was you came here, you ran, you do well, it helped you raise money to go on to New Hampshire. Now these candidates have plenty of money to sustain those campaigns long after Iowa. So, Dianne Bystrom, what's the big deal with Iowa now if they've plenty of money?
Well, I think the big deal right now is that this is what the media has to cover, in addition to everything else going on, I guess, in the Middle East and the world. But this is the first thing that they're covering. And so there's attention on Iowa because when you want to cover politics, we're first. I think as someone said earlier, it's not because we earned it, it's because we're there. And so I think the media will cover it. I do think this year, because things are so divided, there isn't really a clear-cut leader right now. We have the top 3 people tied. And so if that comes out of Iowa, I would argue this year there's going to be at least 4 tickets that come out of Iowa. And I agree it'll probably be the top 4 right now. And, as someone said the other day, Sanders raised $34 million this last quarter, and that's enough to finance his campaign clear through June. And as we know from 2008, he'll do that. And so, I think the other thing that's going to happen, we have, Bloomberg actually has moved up a little bit in the national polling, and he's basically just buying his way into it. So I do think that there's going to be a bigger impact this year. I think in the first 4 states, we could see just all sorts of different results. And so, it could be after we get past those first 4 states and then go into Super Tuesday, I think the Democratic race is still going to be fairly muddled.
Yeah, and that's important. 2 things have changed since the Iowa caucuses started. One, the arrival of social media and as a campaign tool. And secondly, Citizens United, which has lifted the cork on money. And there's just so much more money sloshing around politics that you take that plus the ability to raise money over the internet and in small dollars. It changes a lot of the premises for why you wanted to come to Iowa and get a ticket out of here.
But I resent the idea that the more money you have, the better chance you have of winning, because that's not necessarily the case. I mean, obviously, if that's the equation, then, there are 2 billionaires running, and they should win, in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and so on. It's personality, it's connection, it's tradition, it's history. And, in New Hampshire, I have a property in New Hampshire. I spend a lot of time there in the summers. The equation isn't very different from Iowa. Plus, I was going to say, the New Hampshireites also expect every presidential contender to come to their town and their house and their veteran of foreign wars place. I mean, I go nuts because they come banging on my door, on my cabin, when I'm trying to just look at a sunset or something. So, I'm not sure that money is necessarily what is going to get somebody the nomination.
Well, and that's actually, it isn't money because you need delegates. And if you don't get at least 15% support in primaries as well as the caucus, you win no delegates. This is across every Democratic event. It's not unique to the Iowa caucuses. So if 4 people are coming out of Iowa at roughly 20% each, maybe a little bit more, there's literally nothing left for anybody else in terms of winning delegates. So they may continue zombie campaigns with all their money for a while, but they're going to have no realistic shot at actually winning the nomination.
But as we just talked about earlier, if they're not counting, if media people aren't counting delegates but counting initial preferences.
Right, but the media doesn't decide the nominee. You need a majority of the delegates at the Democratic National Convention. So no matter what the media is telling us about, the issue is how many delegates have you won in each state? And if you don't get at least 15% of the vote, either at the congressional district or the state level vote, you will have 0 delegates from that state.
Dennis?
There's a third factor. You mentioned 2 factors. I think there's a third one to which I don't have the answer, and I would just pose it. Have the DNC's debate criteria and this whole series of debates had an impact on the caucuses? Have they diminished the importance of the caucuses or amplified them or not bothered them at all? But it seems to me there's something important there to look at.
What's your answer to your
I
question?
don't have one. I think it's almost like a parallel track that in some way in terms of coverage, my initial thought is it's sort of dampened a little bit of the attention to the caucuses.
I think the answer to your question is it has diminished the role of Iowa. It's now the DNC's debate rules that winnow the field. It's not a bunch of people in small-town Iowa standing up and expressing preferences.
That may have been part of their rationale.
What does anybody else think about that?
I think that I agree. I think that it's affected the caucus, diminished the effect of the caucuses, and also made it difficult for some of those candidates that maybe could get a foothold in Iowa without a lot of money, are now having to focus on getting all these $1 donations to get on a debate stage to maintain viability for a national campaign, has kind of pushed them out of the field. I think Cory Booker has hung on, but I think he's an example of one that's on the bubble. Castro, Gillibrand, some of these candidates that I think could have done better in Iowa have been kind of forced to spend their time doing this other stuff that the party decided they should do.
Pev?
I'm a little skeptical that the debates have had much of an impact. And I suspect as we run up to caucus day that the focus on Iowa will be so overwhelming that any memory of the debates will have dissipated. And if you recall from the debates, it was Harris who had the big moment initially, and then the second or third debate, Castro had his breakout moment, and of course they're both gone already. So I think your characterization as a parallel track may be more correct. I also think the fact that the Democrats have lined up in sequence for different events around the country has also diminished the singular importance of Iowa to some extent.
One thing, Pev, though, is in an effort to diminish the significance of Iowa, other states have moved their contests closer to Iowa's. This has been a pattern. The unintended consequence of that historically has been to simply make Iowa that much more important, because the only way a candidate is going to compete in California, for example, is through media. That's the way they do politics there. And where do you get media if you don't have a big budget? You win Iowa, and then it's free media. And the bounce that comes out of these early states does have an impact.
Yeah, but we have candidates now that seem to be well-funded. Even Klobuchar, who is running the risk of finishing fourth or below in the first couple of contests, has enough money to at least hang on to Super Tuesday. And then, of course, we have this novel contribution of Bloomberg and being able to sort of wait until Super Tuesday to make his entrance. And so what I think that does is Iowa will be important. We'll talk about it up until the day after Iowa, and then we'll talk about New Hampshire up until the day after New Hampshire, and then we'll turn to South Carolina. And at that point, sort of the winning that has been traditionally done by Iowa will be done by the first sort of three, maybe four with Nevada before Super Tuesday.
One factor that enters into this question about should Iowa be first and the role it plays is some candidate is going to win the White House and some party's candidate is going to lose. The winning candidate is likely to be someone who has come through this path, and they're sitting in the White House and saying, why do we want to mess around with changing the rules of a game we just won? In fact, we're sitting in the White House now. We're going to make sure that we do well and tend our fences in Iowa so we don't get ambushed by a challenger in a primary. That's as Kennedy found with Carter, as Bill Clinton found when he just shut down any talk of a Jesse Jackson primary in 96 over welfare reform. So they don't want to change the rules of a game they just won. The party out of power that just lost, two things happen. There is this debate Dennis just referred to. Are we better off with a moderate message or a more extreme message? Liberal in the Democratic Party, conservative in the Republican Party. So there's that argument over why they lost. And the second reason they lost is, they conclude they lost, is Iowa. Who gave us this turkey? And they blame Iowa, and there's where you have the argument and the churning begin for making reforms. They go to the National Convention, where they change rules for the next convention. And the other thing that happens is the two nominees go to the people who want to change the process and say, look, our job is to worry about the November election. It's not to worry about the process in 4 years. So forget this talking about Iowa and New Hampshire and these early states. We had to keep our eye on the ball. And New Hampshire certainly is a battleground state. Iowa may be, so we don't want to alienate those people. And inertia, Dennis's rule, it's important because it's first, just continues this, because you never reach a consensus in America on how this process ought to be changed.
There are two criticisms, and I know you agree with this. Iowa isn't diverse enough. How did Barack Obama win the Iowa caucuses? The Democrats have an incredibly liberal perspective in this state. That's the only thing that counts. It doesn't matter, the ethnic composition of the state. And there are a lot of Latinos and African Americans here, but if Barack Obama hadn't won the caucuses in Iowa, I doubt that he would have gone on to get the nomination. I mean, it credentialed him that a state with a lot of non-black and Hispanic voters trusted him. And, the other thing is the argument that Iowa makes the caucuses so complicated. I just got an email from a very famous Iowa political consultant. People can't really afford to go for 2 hours at night and participate in caucuses because, they're busy and so on. That's why the Iowa caucuses turn out only about 10% of eligible voters. Well, the Pew Center has some great statistics. Primaries don't turn out many more voters. A lot of primaries are maybe 12, 15% of the eligible voters. And then we have this big academic argument how you do the statistics on turnout, and forget about it. Academics are crazy that way. The truth of the matter is that going and stopping at a polling place in wherever it is and voting in a primary and not having to spend 2 hours in the caucus and only taking 10 or 15 minutes to vote in the primary is also too difficult for most people, or they're just not interested in politics. So Iowa doesn't really suppress, the percentage of people who participate.
But it does suppress the people who participate, right? Because the people who can't get off work to go spend 2 hours doing a caucus or can't get childcare or pay for childcare to go do that tend to be people that are of lower socioeconomic groups, are more likely to be women or more likely to be people of color. And when you're in a state already that is very white and you're further depressing the number of the people of color that can go vote, that's disenfranchising that group of people. The other thing is that just because Iowa selected Obama does not mean that that people in this country are well represented by Iowa caucus goers, because we have different life experiences.
Dianne, is Iowa a good place for women candidates?
I would say no. Iowa has a really, until this last cycle, and Kelly Winfrey and I at the Catt Center before I retired when she was ready to run, is that finally Iowa this year has gone up to more than 1/3 of the women in the legislature. 1/3 of the legislature is women. But for those of us doing work in Iowa, and I've done that work for 26 years, Kelly's done it since she came here, getting women to run in Iowa and run successfully. Now, we had a lot of success in 2018, but there was success around the country. And so we raised, Iowa was finally over 25% of its legislature. In my first time here, the year I retired, we got to 33%, but that's hard work by the Catt Center, other organizations recruiting and supporting women. Also in 2018, like the rest of the country, we were able to elect Cindy Axne and also Abby Finkenauer, and then also elect a woman governor. So we look really good right now, but for those of us who have been in the state for a long time, it's a tough sell. I can't tell you how many people told me in 2008 that they really wanted to elect a woman president, but Hillary Clinton just wasn't perfect enough.
Also, the rural areas are shrinking in Iowa, which means urban centers, the cities in Iowa, which tend to be more progressive, maybe have more influence because the rural areas are very conservative in terms of women as well.
Donna Hoffman.
So there's an argument that's being made that the caucuses are essentially anti or undemocratic, and those are valid criticisms. But there is also another side of that coin, which is the caucuses are very little democratic in the sense that states that use primaries are doing the same things at the end of the day that we are doing in Iowa. They are also electing delegates to the national conventions. They are also electing party leadership and platform planks, but it happens in a different way, and it is probably much smaller party activists who are doing that in primary states, because most people think, I'm going to go to the primary, I'm going to vote for my candidate, and it's done. And that's not actually what you're doing. Whether you're in Iowa, whether you're in a primary state, you're going to an event and you are electing delegates to go to the next level of convention. And so it mirrors the indirect process of a national election with the Electoral College in that sense. And so if we think about little d democracy, when I teach a introductory class and we talk about grassroots democracy, what do we hold up as the pivotal thing. New England town halls. This is like a New England town hall. It is regrettable that there are people who can't come to those meetings, and those have real implications. But at the same time, this is where deliberation takes place. It is where civic discussion takes place. It is where party governance takes place. And that sometimes gets lost in talking about some of the anti-democratic nature of the caucuses. But at the same time, there are other democratic aspects of them as well that we also need to factor into that. And democracy in states where these kinds of things aren't taking place, those decisions are still being made. They're being made by a much smaller pool of party activists.
David?
What Donna just said, but let me add, I've done real politics in New Jersey. I was a local elected official. I did activist politics in Iowa. Even as an elected official in New Jersey, I had no involvement whatsoever in the state platform or decisions made by the state party. It was definitely a small group of people, of insiders. I came to Iowa in '99. A couple months after getting here, I was chairing my first precinct caucus, and we were having discussions about the platform and sending things forward and so on and so forth, just to kind of reiterate Donna's point. But I also want to note, no one can argue that Iowa voters are descriptively representative of American voters, of Democrats, even of Republicans. You just cannot make that argument. It's absolutely true. And no one can argue that the caucuses don't make it difficult for some people to participate. On that point, it's a real shame that the Democratic National Committee, I think, unnecessarily spiked the virtual caucus, which would have provided an opportunity for participating outside of the set time and physical location. But Iowa Democrats, at least, and to some degree Republicans, but more Democrats in our research, are highly representative. Those who caucus, when it's a large turnout, as it was in 2008, are highly representative of Iowa Democratic voters as a whole, including on gender, and are ideologically representative of the Democratic Party as a whole nationally. So one of the pushbacks on this, we have a bunch of white guys left, is that the non-white candidates were also not doing well in South Carolina, where independent campaigns are going on, not directly influenced by Iowa, but by the campaigning. 60% of Democratic voters in South Carolina are African American, but none of the non-white candidates in South Carolina were polling more than a couple of percent. So it's not a unique situation to Iowa that the non-white candidates have not been doing well. I do think it matters here. I do think, in fact, there's always some issues revolving around race and around gender, but I don't think that is the reason to say Iowa should not play the role that it plays.
I had a huge argument.
Wait a minute, I want to let Dennis. Yeah.
I was just going to say a version of what David said here. In 2008, when Weinbrenner and I did the third edition of the caucus book, I looked precisely at the issue. Yes, Iowa is not demographically representative of the country as a whole. However, looking at 2008, Iowa Democrats, though somewhat more dovish than Democrats nationwide, pretty well tracked Iowa Democrats nationwide in terms of what they thought the most important issues were. Iowa Republicans were moderately more pro-life than Republicans nationwide, but they too pretty much tracked where Republicans were nationwide. So demography is not necessarily destiny.
I want to switch gears here in the time we have remaining. One of the things I wanted to talk about, we sort of handicapped the race and how we see that playing out. This is a big field of candidates, Pev, and some of them are young enough that they will be around for future campaigns. It's true, many presidents get there on their second or even third go, Nixon, Reagan. Who in this field of candidates impresses you as someone who may not win, but who is going to be in good shape to run again, or comes out of this campaign as an enhanced political figure in America who winds up in the cabinet of the next president, or is an enhanced figure? Who's going to be some of the people who may lose on caucus night, but who are going to be longer-term winners?
Well, the obvious choice is, of course, Buttigieg, who has his name had been bandied about by Democrats at sort of the elite levels for a while, but clearly his ability to mount a national campaign as the mayor of South Bend has been impressive, and would suggest that he'll have a future, although if he doesn't win and the Democrats don't take the White House, exactly where he'll be spending his time and what platform will be available to him is uncertain. Castro is another person who, although did not do particularly well this time around, may be able to reformulate his approach and do better next time around. But again, there's just so much uncertainty even between now and caucus day that I hesitate to write anybody in or write anybody off.
Oh, no, but we're forecasters. I haven't gotten to the 2024 race, which has already started in this state. But let's stick with any names of people who are candidates who are maybe not doing well here, but who have impressed you as people who could be distance runners. Donna?
Well, I would say that there's even some that have dropped out of the race that were fairly impressive. But Kamala Harris, I think, strategically made a decision to drop out when she did, to not put any more resources into the race, to focus on her Senate job. Potentially Beto O'Rourke, I think probably still has things to do. Whether he alienated some people or not, I think is maybe a question. And so even with the people who are no longer in the race, I think you still have a lot of people that could be chosen for cabinet positions, vice presidency, for example. One thing to factor in, though, with the senators in the race is if you have a sitting senator who's going to be tapped for a cabinet position or vice presidential position, what are the rules within that state for the appointment process? The Senate's in contention. The Republicans have more seats to defend than the Democrats do this time around, unlike the previous time. And those will be factors in that too, in those calculations too.
Any other names come up? Dianne?
Well, I would say, the obvious ones have been, said Buttigieg. I think Kamala Harris will be, back. But my prediction is going to be there is going to be a woman or a person of color or maybe both on the Democratic ticket. In one place or another.
And I'll put Cory Booker as someone that we'll see more of, I think is a great VP pick as well. I've been very impressed by him, and I think that he could be a very energetic bottom half of a ticket.
Yeah, fair, but Dianne, to your point about saying it likely to be a woman or a person of color, Amy Klobuchar comes to mind as someone whose name gets mentioned a lot as a really good ticket balancer for any number of those white men.
And kind of getting to that, I like Cory Booker too, but I think, if the nominee is going to be someone from the East Coast, and unless it's Buttigieg, that's what it looks like right now, then I think the tendency to want to pick someone from the Midwest or the Southwest is, and another person we haven't talked about is Stacey Abrams. Her name has been bandied about as well, and she is a very persuasive speaker. She did a great State of the Union response, in 2018, and so, or was it 2019? Yeah. So anyway, but I think she's another person.
On the Republican side, no matter what the outcome is of the Iowa caucuses in 2020, in 2024, the Republicans are going to have to come up with a candidate. Either President Trump is finishing his second term, or the Democrats have won the White House, and Republicans are going to need a candidate. Dennis, anybody, what sort of Republican candidates look like people who might be people who could do well in Iowa? We've seen Nikki Haley coming out here.
Sure. Hawley is at Missouri, senator, seems to have an interest, possibly Mike Lee from Utah, Cotton from, Senator Cotton from Arkansas. The big
Jim
debate
Langford,
there would
Oklahoma.
be for the Republicans, is it going to be Trumpism without Trump, or are they going to move in a different direction? And they could face their own kind of political civil war after Trump.
We'll have to have another panel in 4 years.
There you go.
Marco Rubio.
Stephen? Marco Rubio?
He's been on the news a lot, kind of explaining what's going on and not quite on Trump's side and finessing it. And he's a very good speaker and kind of charismatic. And obviously he's a Latino, so.
Just real quickly, Democrats still haven't finished the generational shift that Republicans started some time ago. If you do the math, roughly speaking, Buttigieg could wait 8 presidential cycles to run and still be younger then than Sanders and Biden and Warren are now. So Democrats still have to do that generational shift. The Republicans are ahead of them in it.
Stephen? Stefan, I thought you had I thought I saw your hand. Dianne?
Well, I think Nikki Haley on the Republican side is someone who's trying to position herself. I think, there's been some predictions actually in the literature that actually a first woman president is actually going to be a Republican rather than a Democrat. And so I think she's positioning herself. There's big rumors in Nebraska that Ben Sass is trying to position himself for a run. And again, coming out of a more, he was kind of a Trump critic, but certainly has dampened that criticism and actually was endorsed by Trump for his Senate campaign.
Why do you say that the first woman president may, in fact, more likely be a Republican than a Democrat?
I'm going to have to go back to, there's just been, I think the way the process is in the Republican Party over the Democratic Party, winner take all type of thing. I think it's the way the Democrats do it. It is kind of this confusing mess of splitting up the delegates. And Kelly, I think has something.
Yeah,
more to
no,
add.
I was gonna add, the process tends to favor Republicans, but also Republican women tend to be viewed kind of generally as more moderate than Democratic women. Democratic women are often viewed as the most liberal of the kind of party by sex component. So if you're going to get a woman elected, you got to get a lot of people on board. So somebody that's viewed more moderately is more likely to do that. Now, having said that, there are some Republican women that are extremely conservative these days that would have a hard time, but someone like Nikki Haley might be able to walk that line.
Donna?
Nobody thinks Mike Pence might be thinking about running for president in 2024.
Well,
I think it's interesting that
I
he
noticed
hasn't been
he
named,
did
right?
visit the same flood twice here in Iowa, so we have to include him. And he's from Indiana. He'd do well. He's could be a Midwestern regional favorite, just like in the past.
A lot depends on, obviously a lot depends on whether Trump wins re-election or not. This time in terms of whether Pence is damaged or not going into 2024.
But it is true the Republican Party is going to have a debate that's going to start here over what it is, what it stands for in the post-Trump era, correct? Donna Hoffman, go back to Dianne Bystrom's comment about the first woman president is likely to be a Republican. You agree or disagree?
I think it's probably a toss-up, but there is a valid argument in that. We can look at Joni Ernst in the state of Iowa being the first elected female senator in that sense. But one I wouldn't also discount on the Republican side would be Will Hurd, who's the only African-American Republican who is retiring, actually, because he's in a very tough district. But I believe he's already scheduled a visit for New Hampshire coming up. And obviously that's not for this cycle. But a similar kind of argument. We could see another African-American president, and it might actually be a Republican, and he would be the one kind of positioned at this point to go down that path and at least explore where we're going there. And so, those are things that we can't discount in terms of thinking about the Republican coalition not being very diverse, but yet you could have the capabilities of some candidates within that coalition to be diverse and still excel, precisely because Nikki Haley, Will Hurd, all of these people that we've mentioned, because they are people of color or female or both, that could try to unite that coalition of what happens after Trump, because I think that's the key question here. As you go forward, is it going to be the party of Trump continuing on, or is it going to be something different? And the Republicans haven't made that decision yet, I don't think.
We're nearing the end of our time, and I want to ask anybody if they have any closing thoughts or comments about this whole question of Iowa and being first. Maybe what should Iowa be doing to try to hold on to its place, or what's the alternative? A national primary? How about doing the caucuses on a Saturday evening? Any thoughts about those kinds of questions?
There is. A national primary is not, I think, a viable alternative. There are a lot of issues involved in that we can't get into. The real question is, what happens in 2020? If Donald Trump wins re-election, I think the Iowa caucuses are in really serious trouble at that point because the Democrats will continue to be arguing about whether the system works. The new rules are meant to open it up more. There will be additional pressure. It's sort of a political ideological thing to have accessibility for Democrats. And I honestly am not sure the caucuses can survive that for 2024. If Trump loses and the Democrat who wins runs again in 2024, whatever Democrats want about the caucuses will be completely irrelevant, and it'll be the Republicans who will drive it. They do not have the political ideological position about opening up the caucuses, about making them accessible. They don't have that battle. And I think in that case, the Republican caucuses continue on.
Yeah, I mean, it's been true, as I mentioned earlier, the losing party always has a debate over its message and its process. And if the Democrats lose, then there'll be more arguments about Iowa's role in this process. Any other comments?
Well, I agree with David, but I think the other thing that is going to happen, especially if the Democrats lose, and he basically said this, is that there's going to be continuing pressure, I think, among Democratic Party members in this country to do something different, because it seems to be a lot of unhappiness. You see it on the media all the time, about Iowa, and no matter how we argue that our caucus goers turn out to be more representative of the total Democratic Party, which I think they are. It's also about, I think, expanding the vote, and you see that now with the rising electorate. And no matter what you want to say, and I know we're running out of time, but the two states in 2016 that had both a caucus and a primary were Washington and Nebraska. In Nebraska, 34,000 people voted in the caucus. In the non-binding primary, there were 80,000. It was more of a difference in Washington state, where 800,000 people voted in the primary and about 300,000 showed up for the caucus. So, I think if we're about expanding the electorate, a caucus doesn't do that.
I want to thank all of you for taking time to be here and to participate in these discussions. I really appreciate that. I want to thank the State of Iowa Historical Museum for sponsoring this. I'd like to thank C-SPAN for covering this event. I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for spending some time with us today. Thank you all for being here. We're adjourned.